The cabin sat at the edge of the Yukon settlement, and everyone who passed it had something to say. Most of it wasn't kind. They called it peculiar. They called it wasteful. Some called the man who built it worse names than that, saying he didn't understand how things worked up here, saying he was too scared of the cold to make it in the north, saying he'd wasted his money on foolishness. What bothered them most was the roof, or rather, the roofs. While every other structure in the territory had a single roof, practical and proven, this man had built two. One roof sitting a full 2 feet below another, with a space between them that seemed to serve no purpose anyone could understand. It looked ridiculous. It looked excessive. It looked like the work of someone who didn't belong in the Yukon territory. His name was Anders Nilsson, a Swedish immigrant who'd arrived in Dawson City in the spring of 1902. He was 40 years old, unmarried, and quiet in a way that made people assume he was simple. They were wrong about that. Anders had grown up in northern Sweden, in Kiruna, where winter lasted 8 months and temperatures regularly dropped to 50 below zero. He'd worked in the iron mines there, living in conditions that would have killed most men. He knew cold, real cold, the kind of cold that creeps through walls, that finds every weakness in a structure, that kills silently while you sleep. When he filed his mining claim in the Klondike and decided to build a permanent cabin rather than live in a tent like most prospectors, he didn't build like the other men. He built for the worst winter he could imagine. And in the Yukon, the worst was worse than most people wanted to imagine. The standard cabin in Dawson City and the surrounding mining camps followed a pattern that had worked well enough for most prospectors. Single-wall construction using logs 8 to 10 inches in diameter. Corners notched with simple saddle joints, gaps between logs chinked with moss and mud. A single-layer roof made from split logs covered with canvas or tar paper. Then a layer of sod for insulation, one small window, a sheet metal stove in the center or against one wall, dirt floor, maybe covered with boards if the owner had time and money. Total construction time for a man working alone was 2 to 3 weeks. Total cost was minimal, maybe $30 to $40 for the stove, nails, and whatever couldn't be scavenged or cut from the surrounding forest. These cabins worked adequately for the relatively mild winters the Yukon had experienced in recent years. Temperatures dropped to 20 or 30 below, certainly. But with a good fire going, a man could survive. The single roof kept out most of the snow. The log walls provided some insulation. It was enough for most prospectors who planned to work their claims for a few years and then leave. Anders Nilsson had different plans. He'd seen what real cold could do. In Kiruna, he'd watched men die in their sleep when their heating failed. He'd seen cabins where the walls were coated with ice on the inside, where the temperature never rose above freezing even with a fire burning constantly. He'd learned that in extreme cold, adequate wasn't enough. Adequate meant suffering. Adequate meant danger, and sometimes adequate meant death. So when he began construction on his cabin in June of 1902, he made decisions that seemed strange to everyone watching. He chose his site carefully, not on flat, open ground like most cabins, but in a slight hollow protected by a rise to the north. He built a stone foundation that extended 3 feet below ground and rose 1 foot above it. He cut logs that were 14 inches in diameter, much larger than necessary. And most notably, he announced his intention to build a double roof system. The first person to openly question his methods was a prospector named Jack McAllister, whose claim adjoined Anders's property. McAllister was in his 50s, a veteran of multiple mining rushes, and a man who believed his experience gave him the right to advise newcomers. He stopped by Anders's construction site one afternoon in July, watched for a while, then shook his head. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," McAllister said. "A cabin's a cabin, 4 walls and a roof. You don't need all this." Anders continued working, carefully notching a log. In Sweden we build different, he said, his English accented, but clear. Well, this isn't Sweden. This is the Yukon. We build fast here because the season's short. You're still working on your foundation while other men are already under roof. Fast is not always best, McAllister laughed. Fast is what keeps you alive. You need to get this done before August or you'll be finishing in the cold. And what's this I hear about you planning 2 roofs? That's the craziest thing I've heard since I got here. Anders set down his tools and looked at McAllister directly. You have been here how many winters? This'll be my 3rd. And the coldest you have seen? Last February hit 40 below for a few days. It was cold, I'll grant you, but manageable. 40 below is not cold, Anders said quietly. 40 below is warning. Real cold comes after. McAllister shook his head again and walked away. The story spread through the prospector community. That Swedish fellow building the fortress, too scared of cold to build sensible, wasting time and money on a cabin that would be standing long after he'd given up and gone home. The mockery grew as Anders's unusual methods became more apparent. He wasn't just building large, he was building with an obsessive attention to detail that seemed excessive in a frontier mining camp. Every log was carefully selected, debarked, and allowed to season for 2 weeks before use. Every joint was precisely cut and fitted. Every gap was chinked, not once, but 3 times, with different materials in each layer, and that roof, that bizarre double roof, became the main source of ridicule. Anders began the roof construction in late July, and that's when people really started talking. He built the first roof layer using heavy beams, much thicker than necessary for a standard cabin roof. These beams ran the length of the cabin, spaced 2 feet apart. Across these beams, he laid split logs, flat side down, fitting them tightly together. Over this, he spread a thick layer of clay mixed with sand and grass, creating a seal. Then came the controversial part. He built a second set of supports, rising 2 feet above the first roof layer. These supports were vertical posts, carefully measured and positioned, creating a framework that would hold a second roof. Between the 2 roof layers, he created a space, an air gap that would be enclosed on all sides once the structure was complete. What in God's name is that for? A prospector named William Thomas asked one day, watching Anders work. A small crowd had gathered, all of them finding entertainment in what they saw as Anders's folly. Airspace, Anders replied, not stopping his work. Airspace? You're building a cabin, not a damn balloon. What's the airspace supposed to do? Keep warm air in, keep cold air out. Thomas laughed, and others joined him. Son, warm air rises. It's going to rise right up into that useless gap you're creating and sit there doing nothing. You'd be better off with a regular roof and a good thick layer of sod. Anders paused and looked at the men. Warm air rises, yes. This is true, but in 2 roof system, warm air has nowhere to go. It is trapped. Cannot go outside because second roof is above. Cannot come back inside because first roof is below, so it stays in middle, and it insulates. That's the dumbest thing I ever heard, someone in the crowd muttered. You're creating a heat trap that's going to make your cabin unbearable in summer, another man added. Summer is not problem, Anders said. Winter is problem. But the men weren't interested in his explanations. They'd seen enough. The Swedish fellow was building wrong, and come winter, he'd learn his lesson the hard way. They left him to his work, shaking their heads and making jokes about the man too scared of cold to build properly. Anders ignored them and continued building. The second roof went up through August. He used the same construction method as the first, heavy beams, split logs fitted tight, a layer of clay sealant, but for the second roof he added additional elements. Over the split logs and clay, he placed a layer of birch bark, which he'd collected and carefully dried. Birch bark was naturally waterproof and wouldn't rot. Over the birch bark he added another layer of split logs, creating a second deck. Then came a thick layer of sod, at least 6 inches deep. with the grass roots binding it together. Finally, over everything, he stretched canvas coated with pine tar for waterproofing. The final roof structure was massive. It weighed far more than a standard cabin roof, which was why Anders had built such heavy support beams. The vertical posts between the two roof layers were carefully positioned to transfer the weight to the cabin's main structural logs. The engineering was precise, nothing left to chance. But to the observers, it just looked like overkill, ridiculous, excessive overkill. The air gap between the two roofs was the key to the whole system, though Anders knew trying to explain it to men who'd never experienced real cold was pointless. That 2-foot space would trap air, and trapped air was an excellent insulator. In winter, any heat that rose from the cabin's interior and made it through the first roof would be trapped in that air gap. It couldn't escape through the second roof because air doesn't conduct heat well. The heat would simply sit there, creating a warm buffer zone that would dramatically reduce heat loss from the cabin. In extreme cold, this mattered more than people understood. A standard cabin with a single roof lost perhaps 30 to 40% of its heat through the roof. Heat rose, found the single barrier, and conducted through it to the outside. A fire had to burn constantly just to replace that lost heat. But with Anders's double roof system, heat loss would be cut by more than half. The warm air trapped between the roofs acted as insulation, preventing the cold outside air from directly contacting the cabin's interior ceiling. There was another benefit Anders had designed into the system, though he didn't bother explaining it to the skeptics. The air gap provided ventilation for moisture. In extreme cold, moisture from cooking, breathing, and daily living would normally condense on the inside of a cold roof, creating ice buildup that could eventually damage the structure. With the double roof system, any moisture that made it through the first roof would condense in the air gap and drain away through small vent holes Anders had placed at the edges. The interior ceiling would stay dry. By early September, the roof was complete. The cabin stood finished, looking strange with its unusually thick roof structure. Anders had also incorporated other features that marked him as different from the other prospectors. His walls were double-chinked with an inner layer of moss, then clay mixed with sand and animal hair, then an outer layer of more moss. His fireplace was built from river stone, with a massive chimney that extended 4 feet above the roof peak. He'd installed a real glass window with interior shutters. He'd built a wooden floor instead of leaving dirt, raising the floor 6 inches above ground level on posts to create an air gap below. Every element served a purpose in his fight against cold. But to his neighbors, it all looked like the work of a man who didn't understand frontier pragmatism. Too much time, too much money, too much effort for a simple mining camp cabin. If you're learning something valuable about frontier survival and building techniques, consider subscribing to our channel. We bring you forgotten wisdom from history that's more relevant than ever. Now, let's continue with what happened when winter arrived. October in the Yukon started mild. Temperatures dropped to just below freezing at night, but warmed during the day. Anders used this time to prepare in ways that seemed excessive to everyone else. He cut firewood obsessively, stacking cord after cord around his cabin until he had enough wood to last 6 months. Other prospectors cut enough for a month or two, figuring they'd cut more as needed. Anders had lived through winters where going outside to cut wood meant risking your life. He also stocked provisions far beyond what seemed necessary. Most prospectors kept a few weeks of food on hand, relying on the trading posts in Dawson City for resupply. Anders filled his cabin with supplies enough flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, and other staples to last through spring without resupply. He traded for an extra stove, a small sheet metal model he positioned near his sleeping area. He acquired extra blankets, extra clothing, extra everything. His neighbors found it amusing. That Swedish fellow preparing for the end of the world. November arrived and brought the first real cold. Temperatures dropped to 20 below. Snow fell steadily, accumulating to 3 feet. The prospectors' cabins all performed adequately. Fires burned, stoves glowed red. Life continued. Anders's cabin, with its strange double roof, seemed no better than anyone else's. Perhaps he'd wasted his effort after all. But Anders knew this wasn't real cold yet. This was just autumn cold, the warning shot. Real cold was still coming. December came and temperatures dropped further. 30 below became common. 40 below hit several times. The single roof cabins started showing their weaknesses. Ice formed on interior walls. Gaps in chinking let in drafts. Men burned through firewood faster than expected, but everyone was still managing. It was uncomfortable, certainly, but survivable. Jack McAllister stopped by Anders's cabin one evening in mid-December. Anders invited him in, and McAllister was surprised by how warm the interior felt. His own cabin, just a quarter-mile away, required constant fire to maintain even a barely tolerable temperature. Here the air was genuinely warm, comfortable enough that Anders was working on equipment repair without wearing his heavy coat. "You're burning a lot of wood to keep it this warm," McAllister said, noticing the fire in the main stove. "Not so much," Anders replied. "Fire has been going only 2 hours. We'll stay warm until morning." "That can't be right. My fire goes out. My cabin's cold in 30 minutes. Anders gestured at the ceiling. "2 roofs. Heat stays in." McAllister looked up at the ceiling, which showed no condensation, no ice, nothing but dry wood. His own cabin's ceiling was coated with frost that wouldn't melt until spring. He was starting to understand that maybe, just maybe, the Swedish fellow had known what he was doing. But the real test came in January of 1903. That's when the Yukon showed what real cold meant. January 7th dawned at 55 below zero, not wind chill, actual temperature. The kind of cold where spit freezes before it hits the ground, where exposed skin turns white with frostbite in under a minute, where metal becomes brittle and wood cracks like gunshots, where breath comes out in clouds that freeze into ice crystals that tinkle as they fall. The cold kept intensifying. January 8th, 58 below. January 9th, 60 below. Then the wind started. A north wind, screaming down from the Arctic, turning the actual temperature into something far worse. With a 20-mile-per-hour wind, 60 below actual temperature felt like 90 below. At that temperature, the cold wasn't just uncomfortable. It was actively trying to kill anything alive. The prospectors' cabins became survival shelters, barely adequate to keep their occupants alive. Men burned everything they could find. They tore apart furniture to feed fires. They burned books, papers, anything combustible. The heat went up and out through the single roofs as fast as the fires could produce it. Inside, temperatures hovered just above freezing, even with fires burning continuously. Men slept in all their clothes, under every blanket they owned, and still woke shivering. Jack McAllister's cabin became unbearable. The walls radiated cold. Frost coated everything. The fire in his stove had to stay roaring hot, but even that barely kept the interior livable. His firewood supply, which he thought would last through February, was half gone by January 15th. He was cutting more wood, but going outside in that cold for more than a few minutes was dangerous. Frostbite attacked any exposed skin almost instantly. On January 16th, McAllister's stovepipe separated at a joint, probably from the metal contracting in the extreme cold. Smoke filled his cabin. He had to put out his fire and go outside to fix the pipe. The repair took 30 minutes in 62 below zero temperatures with wind. When he came back inside, 3 of his fingers were white with frostbite, and his cabin had dropped to 20 below zero inside. He tried to restart his fire, but his hands weren't working properly. The frostbite had affected his dexterity. He got the fire going, but barely. As the stove warmed up, his frostbitten fingers started thawing, and the pain was excruciating. He knew he needed help. He also knew that going back outside was dangerous, but staying in a cabin that might not stay warm enough was also dangerous. He made the decision to seek help at Anders's cabin. He bundled up in everything he owned and stepped outside into the killing cold. The wind hit him like a physical blow. Each breath seared his lungs. The quarter-mile to Anders' cabin might as well have been 10 miles. But he could see smoke rising from Anders's chimney, steady and strong, and he moved toward it. He made it to Anders's door and pounded on it with his good hand. Anders opened it immediately, took one look at McAllister's condition, and pulled him inside. The difference in temperature was shocking. McAllister had left his own cabin at maybe 10 degrees above zero. Anders's cabin was easily 60 degrees, maybe warmer. The warmth hit McAllister like a wave. Anders sat him down near the stove, looked at his frost-bitten fingers, and went to work. He brought snow from outside and used it to gradually warm the frozen tissue. Too much heat too fast would damage the tissue worse. The process was painful, but necessary. While McAllister's hands warmed, he looked around Anders' cabin in amazement. The interior was genuinely comfortable, warm enough that Anders was in his shirt sleeves, not bundled in layers. The stove was burning, but not roaring. A moderate fire, the kind that should barely heat a cabin in this weather. Yet the warmth was everywhere. The walls showed no frost. The ceiling was dry. The floor was warm to the touch. "How?" McAllister finally asked. Anders pointed up. "Two roofs. Heat cannot escape. Walls double-chinked. Heat cannot escape. Floor raised. Cold ground cannot steal heat. Every part of cabin designed to keep heat inside." "I called you a fool," McAllister said quietly. "Many people called me fool," Anders replied without rancor. "But I am warm, and I will survive this winter. That is what matters." McAllister stayed the night. By morning his fingers had recovered enough that he had full movement back. The frostbite hadn't progressed to tissue death, thanks to Anders's quick treatment. But McAllister knew he couldn't go back to his own cabin. Not in this cold. Not with his firewood running low and his cabin barely able to maintain survivable temperatures. "Can I stay?" he asked Anders. "I'll pay you. I'll work. Whatever you need." "You can stay," Anders said. "No payment needed. Winter is enemy. We fight together." Word spread through the prospector community. There was a cabin that could stand against the cold. A Swedish fellow who'd built it right. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 more men showed up at Anders's door, all of them in trouble. One had run out of firewood and nearly frozen before making it to Anders's place. One had developed pneumonia in his cold cabin and needed somewhere warm to recover. One had damaged his stove beyond repair and had nowhere else to go. Anders took them all in. His cabin, designed for 1 person, now housed 5. It was crowded, certainly, but it was warm. The double roof system proved its worth every single day. Anders could burn a moderate fire for 3 or 4 hours, let it die down to coals overnight, and the cabin would still be warm in the morning. The heat was trapped between those 2 roofs, creating an insulating buffer that made all the difference. The extreme cold lasted until early February. For nearly 4 weeks, the temperature never rose above 40 below. Wind continued to make it worse. Prospectors across the territory suffered. Some died, frozen in their cabins when their heating failed or their firewood ran out. Some abandoned their claims and fled to Dawson City, seeking shelter in the town's more substantial buildings. The winter of 1903 became known as one of the worst in Yukon history. But Anders' cabin stood warm through all of it. The 5 men crowded inside survived comfortably. They had warmth, they had food, they had shelter. And they had a profound appreciation for the Swedish immigrant they'd mocked just months earlier. When the cold finally broke in mid-February and temperatures rose to a relatively balmy 20 below, the men ventured back to their own cabins. What they found was sobering. McAllister's cabin had been damaged by the cold. Several logs had split from the temperature stress. His stove had warped. His roof had developed leaks. William Thomas's cabin had suffered similar damage. The man who'd developed pneumonia returned to his cabin to find that everything inside had frozen solid, his water, his food stores, everything. The contrast with Anders's cabin was stark. His structure showed no damage at all, no split logs, no warped metal, no frozen supplies. The double roof had kept the interior warm enough that nothing froze. The careful construction had prevented temperature stress damage. Every excessive measure Anders had taken was now revealed as necessary wisdom. The story spread beyond the immediate area. Prospectors from other camps came to see the cabin with 2 roofs. Anders gave tours explaining his design principles to anyone who asked. He didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply explained what he'd done and why. Heat moves in specific ways, he told the visitors. It conducts through solid materials. It rises. It radiates from warm surfaces. If you understand how heat moves, you can design building to keep heat inside. 2 roofs. This creates air trap. Air is good insulator when it cannot move. Trapped air between roofs stops heat from escaping. Same principle as 2 layers of clothing with air between. Some prospectors took his lessons and modified their own cabins. Adding a second roof to an existing structure was difficult, but some attempted it. Others simply built better, using Anders' principles of careful chinking, raised floors, and attention to heat retention. The casual approach to cabin building that had prevailed before the winter of 1903 disappeared. Everyone built more seriously now. Anders became respected throughout the mining community. The mockery was forgotten. Men sought his advice on construction, on winter preparation, on survival in extreme conditions. He helped everyone who asked, sharing his knowledge freely. He understood something that many frontier people understood. Survival knowledge should be shared, not hoarded. When everyone's shelters were adequate, everyone was safer. In the spring of 1903, a mining engineer from Dawson City came to examine Anders's cabin. The engineer was writing a report on frontier construction techniques for the territorial government. He spent several hours measuring, documenting, and asking questions. "This is brilliant engineering," the engineer told Anders. "The double roof system, the thermal mass of the stone fireplace positioned to radiate heat into the living space, the raised floor preventing ground coupling heat loss, the double chinking system. You've created a structure that's thermally efficient in extreme conditions." "I do not know these words," Anders said. "Thermal efficient. I just build to not be cold." That's exactly what thermal efficiency means, using the minimum amount of fuel to maintain comfort. Your cabin probably requires 1/3 the firewood of a standard cabin to maintain the same interior temperature. The engineer's report led to changes in the Yukon Territorial Building Code. New government buildings were required to incorporate some of Anders's principles, particularly the concept of air gap insulation in roofs. The traditional single-roof construction was recognized as inadequate for the extreme conditions of the North. Anders stayed in the Yukon Territory for another 12 years. He worked his mining claim with moderate success, but he became better known for his cabin building than his mining. He helped construct several public buildings in Dawson City, all of them incorporating his double-roof design. He trained younger men in proper construction techniques for extreme cold. His knowledge became part of the region's building tradition. In 1915, at the age of 53, Anders left the Yukon and returned to Sweden. He'd saved enough money from mining and construction work to retire comfortably. His cabin, the one that had been mocked and then vindicated, was sold to another prospector who maintained it carefully. The structure stood for another 40 years before being dismantled in 1955, when the land was repurposed for other use. When the cabin came down, builders examining the structure were amazed by its condition. The double roof system was still intact and functional. The logs showed minimal rot. The chinking was still solid in most places. The construction had been so sound that with proper maintenance, the cabin could have stood for decades more. Several of the roof beams were preserved and are now displayed at the Dawson City Museum with an explanation of Anders Nilsson's innovative building techniques. The winter of 1903 left its mark on Yukon territory. Official records documented at least 17 deaths directly attributed to the cold, though the actual number was likely higher. Many prospectors simply disappeared, their frozen bodies not found until spring. The number of active mining claims dropped by nearly 40% as men gave up and left the territory. The population of Dawson City decreased significantly, but those who stayed, who learned the lessons, who built better, they became the foundation of the permanent communities in the Yukon. They carried forward the understanding that survival in the North required respect for the environment, careful preparation, and the willingness to learn from those who knew better. Before we continue with the lasting impact of Anders's innovations, take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. These stories of forgotten wisdom and frontier ingenuity deserve to be shared. Click that subscribe button and join us in preserving these important lessons from history. The legacy of Anders Nilsson's cabin went beyond just building techniques. It represented a different approach to frontier life. The typical prospector mentality was about speed, minimum investment, and mobility. Get in, extract wealth, get out. Build cheap and fast because you won't be here long. That approach worked in moderate conditions. It failed catastrophically in extreme ones. Anders represented a different philosophy. Build for the worst possible conditions. Take the time to do things right. Invest in quality construction, even if it seems excessive. Plan for permanence, not just temporary shelter. His approach required more initial investment of time and money, but it paid dividends in reduced operating costs and increased safety. Modern cold climate construction still uses the principles Anders employed. The air gap insulation system he used is now standard in Arctic construction. Modern buildings in Alaska, northern Canada, and Scandinavia typically feature double roof designs with trapped air layers. Some use modern materials like rigid foam insulation, but the principle is identical to what Anders figured out through experience and traditional knowledge from his homeland. The concept of thermal mass positioned inside the insulated envelope to store and slowly release heat is another principle that remains relevant. Modern passive solar homes use concrete floors or stone walls to absorb heat during the day and release it at night. Anders did the same thing with his massive stone fireplace positioned in the cabin's interior. The principle hasn't changed in over a century. The attention to moisture management through ventilation is another element of Anders's design that modern builders recognize as critical. In cold climates, moisture buildup inside structures is a major problem. It leads to mold, rot, and structural damage. Anders's double roof system with its vented air gap prevented moisture accumulation. Modern cold climate construction uses vapor barriers and ventilation systems to achieve the same result with different materials. What makes Anders's story particularly instructive is how his knowledge came from experience with extreme conditions. He'd lived in northern Sweden where winters were brutal. He'd seen what worked and what failed. When he came to the Yukon, he didn't assume the local methods were adequate. He trusted his own experience and built accordingly. This willingness to trust personal experience over local convention is a recurring theme in frontier survival stories. The person who survives is often the one who doesn't simply follow the crowd. They observe, they think, they draw on their own knowledge base, and they make decisions that others might question. Anders was mocked because his methods seemed excessive. But excessive only means wasteful if the worst case doesn't happen. When the worst case does happen, excessive becomes prudent. The social dynamics of Anders' story also deserve attention. He was an outsider, an immigrant with an accent, a quiet man who didn't assert himself socially. When he built differently from everyone else, the community's default reaction was mockery. They assumed their way was right, and his way was wrong because, well, that's how we do things here. The cultural arrogance of assuming local methods are automatically superior to foreign knowledge is a persistent human failing, but Anders didn't let the mockery change his decisions. He knew what he knew. He'd seen real cold, and these men hadn't. He could have compromised, built a bit more like everyone else to avoid ridicule. Instead, he built exactly as he believed was necessary. That stubborn adherence to his own judgment, even in the face of social pressure, saved his life and the lives of others. When the crisis came and Anders's cabin proved superior, the community's attitude shifted completely. The mockery turned to respect. The men who'd called him a fool now sought his advice. This social transformation is important. It shows that frontier communities, despite their roughness, were ultimately pragmatic. Results mattered more than pride. When someone was proven right, the community acknowledged it and adjusted accordingly. The fact that Anders shared his knowledge freely after being vindicated speaks to his character. He could have been bitter about the mockery. He could have said, "I told you so," and let people figure it out themselves. Instead, he patiently explained his methods to anyone who asked. He helped modify other cabins. He trained other builders. His generosity with knowledge amplified his positive impact on the community far beyond just his own survival. This pattern of knowledge sharing was crucial in frontier survival. Communities where people shared techniques and helped each other had higher survival rates. Communities where people hoarded knowledge or competed ruthlessly had lower survival rates. The harsh environment was enemy enough. Adding social competition on top of environmental challenges was often fatal. The economic aspects of Anders's design are also worth examining. His cabin cost significantly more to build than a standard prospector's cabin, perhaps 3 to 4 times as much in materials and labor. But over the course of a winter, his reduced fuel consumption meant he burned 1/3 the firewood of a standard cabin. By the end of the first winter, he'd probably recouped his extra construction costs just in fuel savings. Over multiple years, the economics strongly favored his approach. His cabin didn't suffer cold damage that required expensive repairs. He didn't have to spend time cutting emergency firewood in dangerous conditions. He could work his mining claim more efficiently because he wasn't spending all his time just staying warm. The initial investment in quality construction paid ongoing dividends. This is a lesson that applies far beyond cabin building. Quality construction, whether it's a building, a tool, or a system, often costs more initially, but saves money over time through reduced operating costs and repairs. The frontier tends to reveal this truth starkly because failure is so obvious. A cheap cabin that can't keep you warm isn't just inconvenient, it's potentially lethal. Modern society has somewhat obscured this lesson because we have backup systems. If our heating fails, we can call for repair service. If our house is inefficient, we just pay higher energy bills. The immediate consequences of poor quality construction aren't as severe, so we often choose cheaper initial cost over long-term efficiency. But the principle Anders understood remains true. Building right the first time, even if it costs more, is usually the most economical approach in the long run. The environmental knowledge embedded in Anders's design also deserves recognition. He understood how cold behaves, how heat moves, how wind affects structures, how moisture cycles through buildings. This wasn't book learning, it was experiential knowledge gained through observation and through suffering the consequences of inadequate shelter. Every principle he applied had been tested in the real world. This kind of environmental knowledge has been largely lost in modern society. We control our environments with technology to the point where we no longer need to understand them deeply, but that makes us vulnerable. When the technology fails, when the power goes out, when supply chains break down, we suddenly find ourselves without the knowledge our ancestors took for granted. Anders' story is a reminder that this knowledge still matters. Understanding how to build for extreme conditions, how to manage heat and cold, how to work with natural materials and principles, these skills remain relevant. Climate change is making weather more extreme and unpredictable. Infrastructure is aging. Energy costs are rising. The ability to build and maintain efficient, resilient structures is increasingly valuable. The comparison between Anders' methods and modern outdoor gear and survival equipment is instructive. Modern hikers and campers often rely on high-tech equipment that works well in moderate conditions but can fail catastrophically in extremes. A high-tech tent is wonderful until the zipper freezes or the fabric tears. A high-tech sleeping bag is excellent until it gets wet and loses its insulation. Modern gear often prioritizes lightweight and packability over robustness and redundancy. Anders' approach was the opposite. Heavy materials, multiple redundant systems, overbuilt for maximum durability. His cabin weighed tons and couldn't be moved, but it could withstand anything nature threw at it. In modern terms, he chose resilience over efficiency. For survival in extreme conditions, resilience is more important than efficiency. This doesn't mean modern technology is bad. It means understanding the trade-offs. Lightweight gear is wonderful for normal conditions, but for extreme conditions, old-fashioned, overbuilt designs often perform better. Knowing when to choose which approach requires judgment based on experience or learning from others' experience. The story of Anders Nilsson's cabin also speaks to the importance of preparation before a crisis. By the time that extreme cold hit in January 1903, it was too late to build better. The men whose cabins were inadequate had to survive in inadequate shelters or seek help elsewhere. The decisions that mattered were made months earlier during construction, when the weather was mild and the danger seemed distant. This principle applies broadly to all forms of crisis preparation. The time to prepare is before you need it. Once the crisis hits, your options are constrained by decisions already made. Anders understood this viscerally. He'd lived through crises where the unprepared died. So when he built for the worst he could imagine, even knowing it might never come. As it turned out, the worst did come. His preparation saved not just his own life, but the lives of 4 other men who found refuge in his cabin. Those 5 men survived the winter of 1903 because Anders had made correct decisions 6 months earlier. The men who mocked those decisions ended up benefiting from them. There's a certain irony in that. The community that ridiculed Anders for his excessive caution ended up being saved by that very caution. McAllister, who'd openly laughed at the double roof design, survived because of that double roof. The lesson was clear. Excessive preparation looks wasteful only until the crisis arrives. Then it becomes revealed as prudent wisdom. The winter of 1903 also revealed something about human nature and crisis. When conditions were merely uncomfortable, people maintained their pride and their criticism. But when conditions became life-threatening, all that evaporated. McAllister came to Anders' door because staying in his own cabin meant dying. Pride matters less than survival. When the crisis is real and immediate, people set aside their ego and seek help from anyone who can provide it. Anders' willingness to help men who had mocked him speaks well of him. He didn't turn them away. He didn't demand apologies. He simply provided shelter because it was the right thing to do. In extreme conditions, petty conflicts become irrelevant. The shared struggle to survive creates bonds that override previous antagonisms. The 5 men who crowded into Anders' cabin that winter came out as friends, united by their shared experience of surviving what had nearly killed them. The physical principles Anders understood and applied remained fundamental to building science. Heat transfer occurs through conduction, convection, and radiation. Insulation works by trapping air and preventing heat movement. Thermal mass stores heat and releases it slowly. Moisture management prevents structural damage. These aren't matters of opinion or style. They're physical laws that govern how buildings perform in cold climates. Anders didn't know the scientific terminology. He probably couldn't have explained the physics in formal terms, but he understood the principles through observation and experience. He knew that heat rises, so he trapped it with a second roof. He knew that air is a good insulator when still, so he created still air spaces. He knew that mass stores heat, so he built a massive fireplace in the interior. His intuitive understanding of these principles was as effective as a modern engineer's calculations. This highlights an important point about knowledge. Formal education and scientific understanding are valuable, but practical experience and careful observation can lead to the same effective conclusions. Anders had the advantage of growing up in a culture that had been building for extreme cold for centuries. Swedish and Norwegian building traditions had already worked out many of the optimal solutions through trial and error over generations. Anders brought that accumulated cultural knowledge to the Yukon and applied it. In contrast, the other prospectors were mostly from milder climates. They brought building traditions that worked fine in those milder climates, but were inadequate for the extreme Yukon winters. They didn't have the experiential knowledge base to draw on, so they built what they knew, and what they knew wasn't sufficient. This pattern repeats throughout history. People moving into new environments often bring inadequate techniques from their old environments. The successful ones learn and adapt. The stubborn ones suffer or fail. Anders had the advantage of coming from a climate similar to the Yukon, so his techniques transferred well. But even if he'd come from a mild climate, his willingness to observe, learn, and build for worst-case scenarios would likely have served him well. The modern relevance of Anders' story extends beyond just building techniques. It's about the mindset required for successful preparation and survival. Don't assume recent conditions predict future conditions. Don't let social pressure override your own judgment. Don't cut corners on things that matter for survival. Don't be afraid to invest extra effort and resources in preparation, even if others think you're excessive. These principles apply whether you're building a cabin in the Yukon or preparing for any potential crisis. Climate scientists tell us that weather extremes are becoming more common. The stable, predictable climate patterns of the 20th century are shifting. Record high temperatures, record low temperatures, record precipitation, record drought. The extremes are becoming more extreme. In this context, building for the worst case becomes more important, not less. Anders Nilsson died in Sweden in 1932 at the age of 70. He'd spent his final years in relative comfort, living on his mining savings and a small pension. He occasionally told stories about his years in the Yukon, including the winter when his cabin saved 5 men from freezing. But he never boasted about it. To him, he'd simply built correctly for the conditions he expected. The fact that others had mocked him and then been proven wrong was just a natural consequence of experience versus inexperience. The cabin he built, that strange structure with 2 roofs and excessive attention to detail, stood for over half a century. It sheltered multiple families over the years. Everyone who lived in it commented on how warm it stayed in winter, how little firewood it required, how comfortable it was compared to other cabins. The strange design that had seemed like folly became recognized as brilliant engineering. When the cabin was finally dismantled in 1955, old-timers gathered to watch. Some of them had been there in 1900, and 2 in 1903. They remembered the mockery and the vindication. They remembered the winter that nearly killed them, and the Swedish fellow whose cabin saved them. As the structure came down, piece by carefully constructed piece, they told stories about Anders Nilsson to younger people who hadn't known him. "He built for the worst," one old-timer said, "and when the worst came, he was ready." That's what the North teaches you. Hope for the best, but build for the worst. That principle, carved into the history of the Yukon Territory through the survival of 5 men in an extreme winter, remains as relevant now as it was then. When everyone tells you you're being excessive, you might just be the only one being realistic. When everyone mocks your caution, you might be the only one who understands the actual risks. When everyone laughs at your double roof, you might be building the structure that saves lives when the extreme cold arrives. The neighbors laughed when Anders Nilsson built a roof under his roof. They called it foolish, excessive, wasteful. They were certain he didn't understand how things worked in the north. Then the temperature hit 60 below zero with wind, and that double roof turned out to be the difference between life and death. The structure they'd mocked became the place they fled to for survival. And in surviving, they learned the lesson Anders had tried to teach them from the beginning. Build for the worst you can imagine, because sooner or later, the worst will come. That lesson, preserved in the story of a strange cabin with 2 roofs in the Yukon Territory over a century ago, echoes across time. It speaks to anyone facing uncertain futures, changing climates, and potential crises. The person everyone calls a fool for over-preparing is often the only wise person in the room, and when the crisis arrives, their excessive caution becomes the common-sense prudence that saves lives. The neighbors laugh until the storm hits. Then they understand. Then they wish they'd built like Anders built. Then they know that sometimes a roof under a roof is exactly what survival requires.